Today's video begins a series that may seem odd for a discussion about plans to colonize Mars. Its purpose will become relevant to those who persevere, however, and watch one or more of these videos. These videos address two subjects on which I believe I have more than an average expertise. These two subjects are environmental matters and income taxation. I will not tell you how I came about such knowledge, but I will expand slightly on what I think I know. As for environmental knowledge, I understand quite a bit about greenhouse gases, pollution, relevant pollution laws, environmental controls, etc. As for income taxes, I'm knowledgeable concerning the massively complex income tax rules in the US, especially personal income taxes. I also know what happens when various tax laws are introduced. Today, I will focus on taxes in general. The second video will address taxes at the Earth Embassy. The third will talk briefly about how taxing real property on Mars can be used and used intelligently to pay to terraform the Red Planet. A final video will address the idea of environmental taxes in lieu of income taxes to fund projects on Mars and to keep the release of harmful pollutants on Mars in check. It is a well-known fact of economics and human nature that when you tax something, you get less of it. It follows then that if you tax income, you get less income. Less income, logically, usually means less wealth is generated and accumulated by individuals and businesses. I would never argue that income and wealth are the most important things in life, but I can see no obvious reason why societies should not attempt to maximize these two things. Equally, as well demonstrated is that there are benefits afforded wealthy societies that are not available to less wealthy ones. Poorer societies, in fact, generally have intractable problems of great import. As you may have already gathered, I am proposing that there be no income taxes at the Earth Embassy. This applies to both individual income and the income generated by businesses. If you have watched other videos in this series, you know that the ticket program will be a bedrock economic idea for funding the mission to Mars. I admit that is sort of a regressive program of taxation, since rich members of the mission to Mars will pay a smaller percentage of their income than poorer members. In the interest of simplicity and by way of the voluntary nature of the ticket program, I believe this system will not only work for the mission to Mars, but that it will be resented by few people working at the Earth Embassy. The no income tax idea can also be coupled with another that allows not only funds to be raised, but also promotes a positive societal goal. That idea is to enact taxes on the release of pollutants on Mars. The general idea is that a business will not be required to get a permit to release pollutants on Mars, but that it will need to pay taxes on such pollutants. This allows the business to decide, not a bureaucrat with a nice salary and an office far from the business, how much tax to pay. If you release lots of pollutant X, you pay lots of tax. As you reduce the amount of pollutant X being released on Mars, you reduce the amount of tax you pay. At some point, I suppose the viewer should ask, what are taxes used to pay for? Again, if you have watched even a few videos, you should realize that funding for the Confederation at the Earth Embassy will come from the sale of ticket to Mars, not from taxes. On Mars, however, taxation will be needed to pay for programs enacted by the overarching Confederation government there and for programs run by the individual republics. As there will be many different types of republics on Mars, the number and types of programs run by these republics will vary widely, so I leave off on that issue. As for the programs run by the Confederation on the Red Planet, you should already have some idea that this government will be responsible to raise a military force not only to defend the planet, but also to stop any inter-republic wars on Mars that appear to be getting out of hand. In addition, as mentioned, the Confederation will run programs to terraform Mars and to legislate and perhaps administer environmental programs. The permanent constitution on the Red Planet may envision other types of programs that will require funding. This being said, I'm also envisioning that governments on Mars, especially in the early stages of settlement, use private businesses or non-profit organizations to provide goods and services to the maximum extent possible. I know this flies in the face of most thinking in the Western world today. But since most people willing to go to Mars will likely go, at least in part, to escape the nanny state notions currently prevalent in these societies, I do not believe such ideas will be resisted to any great extent. I will address two matters here that might trigger those unwilling to listen to new thoughts, but should illustrate what I am talking about. On Mars, I foresee two types of societal infrastructure: private entities and those essentially run by Martian governments. I argue that very little infrastructure needs to be run by the government, even if the government provides rational legal and other structures to support and encourage such infrastructure. Let me give some examples to illustrate this point. Two basic human needs are for water and for oxygen. There is no reason why, on Mars, such needs could not be fulfilled by private businesses, just as on Earth food, another essential for life, is not provided by the state. Thus, I believe that private for-profit organizations, and non-profits too if they can compete, can provide water and oxygen to people. Water usage can be metered and bills sent accordingly. Oxygen might be handled either as a per capita thing or perhaps as a fee presented to the local community. Either way, there is no need for such services to be organized and run by a government entity. Note these several facts. First, as with food, water supply in the United States is often handled by private for-profit companies. It escapes me why such a system could not be used on Mars as well. A company that provided oxygen to the various shelters and other places where humans need to breathe can similarly be run by private organizations. This brings me to my second point, one that I hope is undergirded by an idea accepted by most viewers. That is this: the ways, places, types and so on of oxygen requirements on Mars will require flexibility in a way that perhaps rivals the varied and differentiated supply of food in the West. At first, oxygen will simply be pumped into small shelters. Later, high oxygen content air might be pumped out of greenhouses and into these shelters. Oxygen will be needed for industrial purposes. If internal combustion engines, using biodiesels from algae or other biological substrates, are used on Mars, these will require a supply of oxygen if they are used outside of domes. Oxygen will be needed in tanks for spacesuits when people go out on the surface. My point is that a private, especially a for-profit private organization, will be much more flexible in meeting these various kinds of oxygen requirements. A government organization, almost by definition, will not be so flexible. Note that nothing in this discussion precludes the fleet or the Confederation from providing seed money to start such businesses or from creating rudimentary infrastructures on Mars and then selling them off later. My main point here is that the inherent efficiency of private organizations over government entities should be exploited on Mars to allow for maximum economic efficiency for the colonists and for the accumulation of wealth in the new society. The next part of this discussion relates to those kinds of infrastructures that could either be handled by a government entity or by a private business. Can roads and bridges be run efficiently by private organizations on Mars? Sure, just as these things could now be run by private organizations on Earth, now that we have transponders, ubiquitous cameras and computers. In fact, many roads and bridges that used to be run by government entities are now run privately. I'm not sure of the status of the idea, but the Pennsylvania Turnpike, one of the oldest high-speed roads in the US, was to be sold off to a private organization. Were it not for traditional ideas and entrenched interests, I suspect that most roads and bridges in the US could be sold off. Users would receive a monthly bill of their travels as recorded by transponders. The user fees would be used to improve and maintain the roadways, tax rebates, etc. As for that infrastructure that should be run and likely owned by the government, I include the program to terraform Mars's surface and to create and maintain most domes for new communities or settlements. These are also, I will briefly mention, traditional government services that can be wholly or in part owned and run by governmental entities. These include police, fire, ambulance, likely prisons, the military, etc. While there is no absolute need that governments provide ambulance services, this is a fine point that I will not discuss. The people on Mars can make their own decisions. The same might be said for police and fire services, especially if crime can be kept low on Mars, as I think it likely will be for a long time. The services mentioned here traditionally are offered by governments, and I see no need to change things when we get to Mars.